In the original short story, Bert and Vicky are on a road trip, attempting to save their marriage. Something long road trips are notorious at helping, as we all know. Luckily for them, just when tensions are high, they run over a child, and suddenly the subject of conversation changes. Don't worry, the child appears to have been killed just before appearing in the road, and thus begins the 46 pages consisting of the short story, Children of the Corn. In short order, the couple argue some more.
Sure? What do you mean, am I sure?
Investigate a church, and meet their ends. It's a straightforward story with some nice clues that flesh out the backstory a fair bit. Just enough information that many other creative people have thought, what's that all about? And then decided to tell us. So how does a 46-page story inspire 11 movies and have such a cultural impact? We have a few factors at play here. First, children having authority terrifies adults. Second, we also find religion, or runaway religious cults to be more exact, terrifying. Third, isolation. There's nobody you can turn to for help. 3 timeless scenarios combined, and you get Children of the Corn, a movie that resonates today just as much as it did back then. I'd argue that if there is something the movies did better than the story, it was to make the 2 main characters likable. In the short story, the couple are exceptionally mean and harsh with each other. Here's a case in point. He was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He decided he was holding it that tightly because if he loosened up, why, one of those hands might just fly off and hit the ex-prom queen beside him right in the chops. We're saving our marriage, he told himself. And that's the tame dialogue between the couple. They're so much harsher with each other. So not only are you indifferent when they're killed, but you're kind of into it. This was an aspect of the story Stephen King found important, though. When he was tasked with writing the script for the movie, the first 35 pages were full of the couple fighting in the car. If we went by the screenwriting rule that each page equals a minute of screen time, then the first draft of Stephen King's treatment of his own short story would have spent almost a third of the movie focusing on a marriage descending into divorce while driving through endless cornfields. If you ask me, that sounds very Tarantino-esque. Or in this case, King did it first, so it would be very King-esque. I'd be into it. Maybe at the time that didn't sound great, as the producers ended up hiring someone else to write the script, but I feel today it would work. The other person they hired to write Children of the Corn was George Goldsmith. At this point in his career, he'd only written or partially written Force 5, a martial arts movie from 1981. He's one of 3 screenwriters credited. Interestingly, Stephen King's inspiration seems to have come from many of the cults and serial killers that were making the news at the time. George Goldsmith's inspiration came from the Iranian Revolution. He was using horror to highlight the dangers of religious fundamentalism, describing a world where it becomes a question of them versus us, and there's no way out. This would be the directorial debut of Fritz Kirsch. He'd only worked on commercials previously. He took the job thinking the movie wouldn't do very well, and attempted to make Children of the Corn a tribute to cheap movies. He also was unaware of how much attention Stephen King's name would bring to the project. Not much of a reader, I guess. He would go on to direct Tough Turf with James Spader and Robert Downey Jr., as well as Into the Sun with Anthony Michael Hall and Michael Perry. Before Children of the Corn was made and inspired 10 more movies after it, it was preceded by a short called Disciples of the Crow. In the King-verse, Gatland is mentioned in it, and is also noted as being near Hemmingford Home, the location in the novella 1922, and the town Mother Abigail from The Stand lives. Something I always like to point out, when I remember, is the connection between horror movies and adult film. João Fernandes, the cinematographer in Children of the Corn, also worked as the director of photography in Deep Throat and The Devil and Miss Jones. Swinging it back to horror, he was also the cinematographer for Friday the 13th, the final chapter, which also came out in 1984. Linda Hamilton probably doesn't need much of an introduction here. She starred in Terminator that same year, 1984, and, well, has been working ever since. Beauty and the Beast and Chuck, to name a couple projects. She also has a lot of voice acting on her resume. Peter Horton was busy filming a lot of television around this time. It Is Enough, Dallas, The White Shadow, and would later find his way onto 30-something. Lately, he stays behind the camera, producing shows like Grey's Anatomy and New Amsterdam. Some of the children have been quite prolific in their own accord as well. John Franklin, the ever-creepy Isaac, would go on to play Cousin It in the two Addams Family movies, and would pop up in everything from Highway to Heaven to Tammy and the T-Rex. Courtney Gaines would be a familiar face by the time the 80s came to an end, appearing in such classics as Back to the Future, The Burbs, 21 Jump Street, and Misfits of Science. Yes, I said Misfits of Science is a classic. I love that show. Though the movie didn't light up the box office, it still made $14 million on an $800,000 budget. Critics also didn't seem to understand the movie. Roger Ebert gave it 1 out of 4 stars and said, "By the end of Children of the Corn, the only thing moving behind the rows is the audience, fleeing to the exits." Its legacy would grow over time, though, eventually to be seen as a classic. Rolling Stone even ranked it the 7th on their list of the top 30 Stephen King movies, saying, "What's most chilling is its deft weaponizing of American cultural tensions between generations, economic classes, big cities versus tiny rural communities, God-fearing conservatives versus liberal atheists." Something critics didn't pick up on at all when the movie came out now seems so obvious. Horror as analogy. It'll continue to be a thing, like it's always been a thing. The legacy of Children of the Corn is profound. 11 movies in total. Personally, I might have seen only a couple of them, but obviously there's enough demand that one seems to get made every few years. Stephen King has even joked that there might eventually be a Children of the Corn in space. He seems just as flummoxed at the number of sequels as we are. I will say that the newer one, from 2020, while it didn't land with the best of reviews, I didn't hate it. I appreciated the GMO type angle they used to tell that story. In the end, it's a story that has legs, and the ability to morph into whatever is happening in the world at that time. Maybe someday, we will get that Children of the Corn in space. I mean, if Jason can go to space, Lord help me if someday I'm making that video. Next up is Drew Barrymore and James Woods in Cat's Eye. See you next time.